Reggie here, and I want to welcome you to another one of my live streams. This is the Comics Today show, a show that we do on Wednesday to celebrate the best day of the week, that being New Comic Book Day. And as part of this show, we typically have a guest or two on to help me to make sense of something that is happening in the world of comics and collectibles. And tonight is no exception. We are going to be joined by a scholar, an author, and also English professor as we continue a conversation that we started a few weeks ago, in which we started talking about the importance of diversity in comics. And specifically, we spoke previously about how the woke mindset is potentially contributing not just to the demise of DC Comics, but potentially to comics as a whole. And I was joined on the show by a wonderful YouTuber by the name of MVP. We had a great conversation. He helped me, and I think many of you out there, to understand the point of view of those that are anti-woke. And if you missed that installment, I would encourage you to go back and watch it. I found the conversation informative. I found it helpful. And we had planned to do a follow-up conversation to continue this dialogue. And that's why our guest is going to be joining us tonight. And again, we are talking about a scholar, an author, an English professor, just to name a few accolades. But we are going to build upon what was started a few weeks ago with MVP. And again, shout out to him for coming on the show and sharing his thoughts. And we're going to be joined here momentarily by our guest for tonight. We're going to dig into this thing and we're going to have hopefully a wonderful conversation that will be informative to people out there that are wondering, how diversity should be handled in comics, because there's a lot of different perspectives and opinions, and we're going to share some additional perspectives tonight. With that said, before we get to the hardcore topics, we are going to name the person that won the short boxed giveaway for this month. And I want to give a huge shout out to Shortbox for putting me in a position every single month to be able to give away a $100 credit to one of my subscribers. And so we have pulled the name. We've identified the individual that is going to win. And I'm trying to pull it up now as I share the name, Mr. Lee. Lee, sir, you are the winner of this month's giveaway of a $100 credit to buy something on the Shortboxed app. And this app is available in the United States, not outside the United States. So that's the one limiting criteria. And you can see here that we basically randomly pulled Lee's name from 213 comments that were left on a video that was released just 8 days ago. So the competition is getting fierce. It's getting fierce, but shout out to Lee for winning this. All he needs to do is to send me an email to Regie@regiecollects.com, REGIE, with his screen name and his government name, which might be the same, and also his mailing address. And I'll get that information to the folks at Shortbox, who will then give me the code that he needs. I would definitely, again, send me the email to Regie@regiecollects.com. I'm trying to definitely move away from the Gmail account. I still get email there. I'm trying to transition everybody to the website email address. It just works better for me. So congrats to Lee. Congrats to everyone that entered this thing. And I will tell you that basically the way that Lee has won this is he simply watched a video that came out from the channel and left a comment behind. He left a comment behind, and I randomly selected his comment, and that's how he is the winner. We do this every single month, and all you have to do is to watch the videos, and in one video every month, there will be me giving you a reminder that this is the Shortbox video, and you leave that comment and you are off to the races. So that's the one thing that I wanted to do, is to make mention of that. I want to go to the chat real quick because this is a celebration of New Comic Book Day. I'm going to go to the chat here, and if you made it to your LCS and you scored some comics, let me know what books you picked up, and if you want to shout out your LCS, we can do that as well. And as a reminder, the show that you are listening to right now, if you're in the live show or watching this on replay, is also available on the podcast. If you search for Reggie Collects on whatever your preferred podcasting platform will be, you will probably find me there and find a ton of episodes where you can take some Reggie on the go. If you're in the car, if you're out working out, if you're doing yard work, you can have me in your ear talking about some comics and some other stuff. So let me go to the chat real quick. Kevin, how you doing, brother? Kevin, it is good to see you, brother. Scrolling through some of the comments here. Cheese, how you doing? It's good to see you in here. Mike says Marvel has 16 black characters compared to DC's 3. Fox had the next Batman. I'm not quite sure if that's accurate, Mike. We may need to tally those scores again, sir. Let me pull that down. We may need to run those numbers back because those don't feel right to me. I will tell you that. Fight the Good Fight. He picked up Ghost Rider 1, Gunslinger 5, Silver Surfer Rebirth, Iron Man, and some older Transformer goodness. You cannot go wrong with the Transformers, sir. You cannot go wrong with them. Let's Into Oblivion says, loving the new Ghost Rider issue. Getting back to those horror roots. I've seen a lot of people talking about the Ghost Rider, but I did not pick it up. I may have to check it out. That's 2 people. The first 2 I clicked on are talking about it, so we may have to snag it. Johnny picked up Spawn 331. That's definitely a good book. That's what's up. L. Smith, who rarely lets me down. A big stack of 35 comics, thanks to some variant covers, some reprints, and some replacements. That's what's up. L. Smith, thank you, brother, for being up in here. My man Vox is in here. How you doing? Was on the road all day. LCS will have to wait until tomorrow, and I'm confident that they will because your LCS needs you, Owen. Scrolling through, no truck again, says my man Mark Andrews. Sorry, brother. It's because you're up there in the frozen tundra known as Canada. Fingers crossed that the truck makes its way there. Doug says he went to the LCS, but only walked away with a couple of pictures. But Dave scored big in the back issues. That's what's up. Scrolling through. 35 comics, brother, that's a small haul for him, Matt Woods. That is a small haul for L. Smith. He normally does more damage than that. We probably should also ask him how many books his wife picked up. Cheese, you're going to have to spell that correctly, Cheese. 1G, just 1G. Cheese. That's it. Scrolling through. You murdered that guy. I just had to click on it because the name is dope. That's a dope name. You murdered that guy. I love it. I hope you did not actually commit murder, maybe on the basketball court, tennis court, or something like that. Maybe not, actual murder. Liger, how you doing? It is good to see you, brother. Scrolling through some of the comments here, seeing what else everybody is talking about. Scrolling through the comments. Yeah, he does have a new name. The Almighty Liger King is how he has historically referred to himself, and now it is Liger Style, aka Tiger Style, of the Wu-Tang Clan. I could be completely off by that, but we were talking about Old Dirty Bastard earlier today, so there you go. Mr. E picked up Berserker, all 3 Spider-Man, Gunslinger, Spawn, Carnage, hard copy of Mouse Comics. Man, there was an LCS in Tennessee, I do believe, where they banned Mouse. This LCS gave away 1,000 copies of Mouse. There was several posts on the Instagram machine that they put out there. They were making magic happen with Mouse. So scrolling through best name on YouTube. There you go. Scrolling through some of the comments here, seeing what else you guys are talking about. Scrolling, picked up 1 through 12 of Crisis on Infinite Earths. That's what's up. Well done. Kevin also picked up Ghost Rider. There you go. And what is that? Hardware, the variant. That's what's up. Scrolling through the comments here. Tiger Style says Liger Style spent too much. So it's a good thing, man. It's a good thing when you are out there supporting your LCSs. That is off. That's a good thing. I think a couple of people having fun with the name. Shout out to Liberty Comics. There you go. All right. So again, as a reminder, this show is available on the podcast. So if you want to take some Regie on the go, you can definitely do that via whatever your preferred podcasting platform is. And also, as a reminder, there was a wonderful blog post on regiecollects.com, written by Dave Bratton. So if you have a moment, check that out. He's written, I think this is his third blog post. The first two were on Black Adam. No surprise there if you know him. But the second one, or the third one that came out today is solid. I would encourage you to check it out if you have the time. regiecollects.com on the blog post. All right. With that, we are going to make a transition. As I mentioned at the top of the show, we a few weeks ago had a conversation with a member of the comic book community about the possibility that the woke mindset is leading to the demise, not just of DC Comics, but potentially of comics as a whole. And so I wanted to kind of understand the pushback against the woke mindset, which I was calling the anti-woke mindset. I wanted to understand that. And I wanted to peel some of the layers back. I wanted to have a conversation with a member of the community to understand that point of view. And I am not afraid to have conversations. Yes, I suffered some, harsh comments in the comment section, but that is part of, if you're going to have a conversation, you have to be prepared, intestinal fortitude to deal with some of the pushback. But we laid a foundation with that conversation. We are going to build upon that conversation today by talking with Dr. Julian. And Dr. Julian is a scholar. He is an author. He is an English professor at Michigan State University, a school I almost went to, but instead went to Howard University. And again, I only named a couple of his accolades. We'd be here all night if I spoke about the rest of the stuff. But with that said, I want to welcome to the show, Dr. Julian. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I have zero complaints. I saw you smile back there when I mentioned, Michigan State University. I saw the video and you were like, I am a Spartan. I was like, ooh, I was almost a Spartan.
I hear you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yes, I am in the English department here, Julian Chambliss. I do study comics, popular culture. I've got books on that subject and I write about that and I think about that a lot. And so, of course, I'm really interested, happy to talk to you. Shout out to my good friend Owen for connecting us.
Owen emailed me before the show the last time it even ended. He was like, I've got people for you. Let's do this. And I was like, whoa. Can I sit down after the show and just take a breather,
Sure.
But Owen was spot on. He was spot on because the plan was always to start a conversation and then turn it into a little bit of a dialogue. And so I am very thankful that he reached out. I'm thankful that he made recommendations, and I'm thankful that you were able to join me on the show.
Sure.
But with that said, let's jump into this thing. I am of a certain age where I think in terms of decades. I'm like a decades guy at this point, right? So it feels like to me, over the last maybe 10 years or so, there seems to be this notion that comics are more than a source of entertainment and escapism. And I'm curious if you can highlight how academics and scholars such as yourself are thinking about comics and also using comics in the educational system, because you actually use them, you study them. So I want to understand that point of view.
Well, I appreciate the need for dialogue around these issues. Of course, as a lifelong comic book fan, let's just get that out of the way. Yes, I do read comics, and I'm a superhero guy. That's what I do my research on. So I'm a Marvel kid. Obviously, the question that are at the center of people's minds right now is around question of representation. And I teach a class. I've taught a class many years on history of comic books, superhero comics in the United States. And, comics are a uniquely American art form. The superhero comic in particular is a uniquely American art form. And so, one premise that I always like to point out to students is that, of course, there's a narrative here that comics have become politicized, and that narrative is incorrect. Comics are, like all culture, political. Let's not forget that the first image of Captain America is punching Hitler in the face, and he's doing that before the United States has actually entered the war. So at some level, the idea that any sort of cultural product is apolitical is a little bit of a misnomer. What really is the question that I think people are struggling with is somehow the idea that the politics that they're seeing in comics don't sort of adhere to their politics. And I do understand that in the sense that the politics that they're being exposed to are coming from voices they have not heard, and are talking about situations that are really at the core of bigger issues in terms of American culture. And comics have been very, very much a part of that conversation. You could think about the idea of the introduction of a Black superhero when that happened with Black Panther and Fantastic Four. That was a controversial idea, but Marvel was reacting to the protests and the comments and the questions that were being asked of it as a company. How are you addressing the civil rights struggle? There's a great book by Sean Howe who talks about the history of Marvel Comics, and he does a great job of sort of outlining the kind of reaction that they had to muster to answer that question. Now, it's always true that people can cherry pick and say, "Hey, well, Stan Lee never wanted to talk about comics," and indeed, Stan Lee is often quoted very, very, very particularly saying Marvel Comics is political, and there's lots of scholarship about how Marvel Comics is actually technically political. It's just the politics are very conservative, right?
Yep.
It's very in line with what at the time is what the main idea is. Even the introduction of Black Panther, I like to point out this is that happens after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that happens after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. That's basically happening after a majority of people, a critical electoral majority, have embraced the idea that, Jim Crow segregation is wrong and we need to change that. And so they introduced a character who was Black but not American, right? There's a great documentary on this subject called White Strips of Black Superman by Jonathan Gales. If you're interested in the introduction of some of these early Black characters, he does a great job of sort of like walking us through the sort of political and social context related to those things. So I understand the nature of some of these debates, but of course, the United States as a country has always been moving forward when it comes to these questions of civil rights and inclusion. And so the voices that you're hearing today in the public square are just simply asking for that same progress to be afforded them. And I think we can all agree as Americans that that's a great thing.
Yeah. One of the things, well, there's a lot there to unpack, so I want to strip some of that stuff back. But one of the things that you absolutely hear from people is the fact that comics should not be political, that they are just entertainment. And the reality, to your point, is that they have always been political. And you cited the Captain America punching Hitler, but there is also there's a school of thought out there that even the first appearance of Superman is a political statement, a pushback against industrialization, where he's smashing the car on the rock. That's a political statement. Now, maybe it's a political statement that people were on board with, to your point, whereas maybe some of the things that are being said now, people are like, whoa, that doesn't line up with what I feel. And that's why people are pushing back. But let me pause there because I saw a few nods of agreement. I want to hear your thoughts to that.
Well, of course, we think about Superman, the first superhero character, highly political character, a character really rooted very heavily in the New Deal, which was controversial social policy at the time coming from FDR. So his early adventures, as many people have written about, are highly political. Like he's fighting against exploitative capitalism. He's trying to protect the downtrodden. And of course, he's also a character coming from Jewish creators who are both interpreting an American identity as second generation immigrants, but also, advocating as many of the sort of political coalition of the New Deal, right? Like you think about urban voters and rural American voters sort of being the core of what historians refer to as the New Deal order. Those are people who look for the government to do more. And that was controversial. They had pushback from conservative elements at the time. Now those ideas are normalized. Like we don't question the idea of Social Security. We don't really question the idea in a very real way of a kind of regulatory state, with a Department of Agriculture, a department doing this, and a department doing that. But it was controversial at the time. And so, to your point, there is a kind of interpretation of modern American culture that you can find in the pages of comic books. And it might be that you're not aware, but one of the great things about comic books is that they become an archive of the American experience, and they're able to allow for the reader to become aware, to gain some knowledge of the consequences of changing social trends. And of course, because comic books are a aspirational and reflective medium, they also are a place where we're negotiating what we aspire to in terms of our identity as Americans, while we're also taking on the challenges of these changing questions around identity and culture.
You just touched on a few things that I was going to get to, because I was watching several interviews that you've done. And in one interview in particular, you made mention that comics chronicle the aspirations and the anxieties that define modern society. And you touched on it just briefly a few seconds ago, but I'm curious if you can add a little bit of texture to what you mean by the fact that comics are chronicling our anxieties and also our aspirations. Like, what does that really mean? Because again, a lot of people think about comics in terms of just pure entertainment, but there may be more that is happening there. So can you speak to that?
Sure. I think one of the things about comics, especially superhero comics, right? And let's be honest, when we talk about some of these controversies, we're 99.99% of the time talking about superheroes.
Yeah.
We're not talking about Image Comics titles that are sci-fi or Western. We're not talking about horror comics. We're talking about the fate of Batman, Superman, the X-Men, so on and so forth. Those characters are characters that are drawn from a well-established historical and cultural narrative, like adventure comic heroes, right? Mm-hmm. These characters have certain values that we accept. I mean, the idea of the vigilante or the vigilant hero is an idea that we can trace back in American context to the 19th century. But that idea is actually, tied to a moment where the state is weak, right? Like, why do you need a vigilance committee in the Old West? Well, because like you don't have infrastructure, so you have to get all the people together and deal with bad things, right? But as the society comes
round up the posse.
Right, round up the posse, right? Yeah, like someone's just robbed. Like, hey, everybody with a gun and a horse. We need to get this man that, like,
right.
Because community and that idea of your neighbor helping a neighbor, community sort of forging together. I mean, this is very important to the American mythology of westward expansion, and those narratives remain very cogent to Americans, even though those narratives leave out huge swaths of people who either A, suffered in that process. Hello, indigenous people.
Yeah.
It wasn't empty. There were people there, or people who contributed but were not recognized. Women of color. Most, 35% of the cowboys in the Old West were either Black or Mexican. You never hear about that. Nat Love, a very famous adept cowboy, cowboy, sharpshooter, hunter, all this stuff. He was whitewashed in American history as Dead-Eye Dick, a white guy, but it was Nat Love. He was African American, probably mulatto of heritage. Bass Reed, very famous lawman who's not. Although I have to say, recently Bass Reed has got a movie, and I was like, hey, Bass Reed's having a moment.
I actually watched the movie, and it was not bad.
It was not bad. I liked it. Ron Perlman, Ron Perlman always delivers.
Yeah.
So these are very, very real questions for Americans, and every time we hear about these stories, I think the vast majority of Americans are actually really compelled by the fact that, I did not know that. And it helps them sort of like recontextualize the question of the national narrative, and the stress around learning about some of these things, and some of the, without question, injustices associated with these things can be stressful. But it's important to recognize that one of the things that has been a constant related to the American experience, and I say this a lot in class, is that these conversations ultimately make the United States a better place. The struggle of African Americans stretching back to the American Revolution around freedom has helped to formulate and expand the idea of what democracy is, what being a citizen is, because those people recognize you're not living up to your idea. If you lived up to your idea, you would be doing this. And those conversations have helped us define citizenship in the United States in the manner that we understand it. So you just think what would happen, what kind of country we would have if you didn't have African Americans striving for freedom, right? Like, it would be a fundamentally different place. And so it's understandable that the narratives can be jarring, but the benefits in terms of the national story have always been positive. And we could see that in the context of African Americans, but we also see that in the context of Native Americans being more included. We can see that in the context of gender equity. We can see that in the context of so many things. So I understand always, especially as a comic book fan, how people might, fixate on a particular character. I got a lot of comics in my attic. I mean, it should make me make this very clear. Bagged and boarded, but there are a lot of them, right?
Yeah.
But that those debates are not new debates; those are old debates, and we've come through those debates in the past. We'll come through them again.
One of the questions that I have here is, when you take comics and you move them from this sphere of just pure entertainment, and you move them towards something that gives us insight into the human condition, some would say that you are essentially doing a disservice to comics, to the medium of comics, because this is what they are. They are just entertainment. I'm hearing a compelling argument from you that they're not just entertainment, that they're a little bit more than that. But could it be that comics, just like other forms of creative expression, can actually speak to multiple purposes at the same time? They can be both entertaining, and they can also provide insight into a group of people that maybe historically have not had a light cast upon them. Is it possible for it to do more than one thing at once?
Of course, any cultural object can be interpreted along a number of different pathways. And so let's think about this as if it wasn't a comic book, what does poetry tell us about the American experience? Well, you can make an argument with poem's just a poem. But you also make an argument that poetry in particular moments captures the feelings of America during the national trauma. You can say that poetry captures and amplifies and celebrates the values that Americans hold dear. There's a reason we have a national poet laureate, and many states and cities have poet laureates, because they rely on these people to give voice to really complicated feelings. But they are just writing poems, and we don't as a society go like, oh well, it's just a poem. We do, but we don't. We can hold two ideas in our head. I'm old enough now that when I teach my any class on comics, I recognize that the students that I'm teaching, a lot of them have not read comics.
Yeah.
They have not read comics. They have only sort of absorbed it through other media. So
through the movies and the TV shows, that's
video games.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, they don't know the version of Harley Quinn from Batman animated series. They only know the Rocksteady Arkham Asylum version, right?
Right.
And you're like, well, that's a very different.
Yeah.
and like that one thing was for kids. One thing arguably is not for kids.
Wait a minute. Harley was for kids at some point? Because I struggle with that one.
Well, I think if you see the way that Paul Dini drew Harley in the Batman animated series versus the way that Harley is sort of composed in the Rocksteady games.
Okay.
One's for younger kids, one's maybe for like a teenager who's just hit a really strong puberty moment.
Yeah.
So the size of the breasts. Let's just be honest here. So there's something to be said for recognizing that cultural objects operate across different media. Now, your emotional attachment to those things, the attachment that we all have to the comics that we love, are not wrong, but those attachments do also exist in the same arena where people are striving for and looking for things that represent them, that are at the core of really important questions around, the society that I live in is way more diverse. And you can think about this, if you look at that great documentary from PBS about superheroes, one of the things that Neil Adams talked about when he introduced Jon Stewart was like, hey, look out on the streets of New York City. Look at what you see.
Yeah.
Like, like we need to have, and Marvel
something that looks like the real world,
looks like us, right? Like looks like what and Milestone, a great comic book company, recently returned and doing great. But the original Milestone was an amazing sort of urban tableau. It wasn't it was called a black comic book company, but there were characters of every color there.
Yeah.
It looked like the world that those creators grew up in.
Yep.
It just did not look like the somewhat antiseptic at some level imaginings of a place like Gotham. I sometimes joke. I once joked with students, Batman as a character in Gotham beats up on white thugs in a way that would not, if you were creating that character today, it would not happen that way.
Yeah.
Like he's forever beating up like standardized white thugs. And I'm like, the reason he's doing that because if you said the Batman story out loud, because I do sometimes say this in class, you would be like, oh, I don't have a good feeling about that, right? Like there's a rich guy, he lives on a hill, at night he dresses up,
comes down to the city
and beats the hell out of people.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And you'd be like, oh, wait, hey, no, I'm not in favor of that. Like, what about civil rights, right? Like, it's okay because it's Batman. It's not okay in terms of like if you think about it.
Yeah. So one of the challenges that I think a lot of people face is not with diversity itself. I think by and large, most people are fine with diversity. Be diverse, be inclusive. But one of the main areas that I think people kind of challenge with or struggle with is when they have that emotional connection to a character and that character is put on the shelf for another character. When that character has a gender swap, when that character has a cultural swap, and I never use the word race because there's only one, it's human race. But when there's a race swap, people struggle with that. What are your thoughts around how these people that have these emotional attachments to characters like Clark Kent, right, and like Bruce Wayne, how should they interpret that when their beloved character is put on the shelf or switched out for someone else for the sake of diversity? What are your thoughts there?
Well, first and foremost, their character still exists. No character ever is put on a shelf, not in comics. Like
or dies for that matter.
Right? Yeah, like the character still exists. What you're really fixating on is the idea that somehow this character that maybe it's a diverse character, maybe it's a different gender. Somehow that character is replacing your character.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really a question of perception. It's not a question of reality. The stories of any character like a Superman, those stories still exist. If they launch a different title, how many variations of Superman? There's Elseworld stories, there's What If stories. There are, especially for a character like Superman, at different moments, anywhere from 3 to 5 ongoing series starring this character. And the business of comics has changed in significant ways. And the idea that same character or that same story world can support other kinds of characters is not unreasonable. And in fact, the initial controversy is always the same, but then after a certain period of time, you acclimate to the character, right? Steel, like it's a prime example. No one questions Steel, but when they introduced some Superman and introduced Steel and several other characters in the aftermath of that Superman story, people were not huge fans of that, right? They were not huge fans of that. These are not questions of erasure, although I think I do recognize how people choose to understand it that way. But again, first and foremost, your character still exists. Miles Morales is another example. The idea that in a completely different imprint, the Peter Parker in that imprint passes away and they replace him with a new character, while the other Peter Parker has still got 3 series, and the amount of comments and angry expletives that you found on the internet just goes to show you that it wasn't about the character. It was about the idea that somehow the fact that a minority character gets to drive the story. And that is the thing, or a woman gets to drive the story, an LGBTQ person gets to drive the story. That's the thing. that is annoying people, that is angering people. But again, it's always important to recognize this is a very small but vocal group of people.
Indeed.
The vast majority of comic book fans are like, let me read the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's Wednesday. Let me see.
Let's see what's out. New comic book day.
Right.
And the truth is, a lot of people objected to Miles Morales that had never even read Miles Morales.
Right.
And I
they
actually
objected to the idea of
they
Miles
objected
Morales.
to the idea. I actually read Miles Morales. I have a full run of Miles Morales sitting over here, and it's fantastic. It's really good, right?
Right.
They never really gave it a chance, potentially because what they were reacting to was the headline, right? The headline of the Black Spider-Man replacing Peter Parker, right? The headline of Superman now being bisexual. It's not. It's technically the son of Superman and not Kal-El, a character that was created in 2015 that is bisexual, not the original Superman. And so I think part of it is that people jump to the conclusion and they're quick to anger without collecting all of the facts to understand that maybe they don't know everything, or maybe they should not be upset. Do you think that that is unique to comic book collectors, or is that just the human condition and like the social age, right? You read the headline, everything you need to know is right there. Now you're mad. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that that's very much a consequence of digital media. I have talked about this in other contexts. The nature of media has changed dramatically. And the thing that drives the value of media is engagement, clicks, right? 50 years ago, a newspaper would spend considerable resources, or a magazine or a news program would considerable resources to write a story, and they could be assured of a profit. And so like their approach to being balanced, the use of a researcher, editors who are coming in to look at this and go, well, you're doing this here and doing that there. You know, think about some of the classic stories of Perry White with Superman, like, oh, like Robbie Robinson with Peter Parker. Hey, that's not a good story. Like,
right.
Where's the angle here?
Yeah.
Like, you need
what's the hook?
Yeah, what's the hook? Like, and are you sure about these sources? Who are your sources, right? A lot of the media that you're absorbing related to comics is almost the exact opposite of that.
Yep.
If they can come up with a good headline,
yeah,
you can become enraged. You haven't read the comic.
Yep.
You haven't seen the evolution of the story up to that point. You're just being bombarded by a series of narratives that get contextualized within a broader narrative of cultural war.
Yep. And it also generates a tremendous amount of money for the person that generates that outrage. There are people that will downright misrepresent something to get people mad, to get people to click so that they can make some cash. And that does not advance the cause, or it does not enrich the community. It actually creates divides among people. At least that is my perception. But I cut you off at the very end there, so I want to pause to let you finish your thought there.
Well, yeah, I do think that that's important. And I remember, when I was in high school, the whole 1-800 number around the fate of Robin, Jason Todd.
Oh yeah.
Right. Now, that was a character that was not well loved. Right? Like,
kill
him, right? Like literally beat him to death. Right? Like, in any other context, you would pause and go like, "Ooh, that was a dark moment in comics." Like, people called in and be like, "Kill that kid. Could you have him beat to death?" Like, if you heard that happen in another context, you'd be like, "Oh my God!"
To be like you said, when you say it out loud, it sounds really bad. When you read it, you're like, that's not so bad. It's when you say it out loud, when you're like, "Ooh, maybe we should have thought about that."
Yeah. If you say it out loud, that's always the test. Kids, hey, if you're about to write something to somebody, if you read it out loud,
that's true. I do that with emails. I'm feisty in the comments until I go back and read it again. I'm like, exactly. let me delete that one. So one
valuable lesson there.
One of the things I want to ask you about is do you think that the focus in comics is a little off? and here's what I mean. I feel like, and again, this is my perception. There's no data. This is my perception that maybe in the past there would be a good story that was being told with an underpinning that might have been political, that might have been moral, that might have had some type of diversity angle in it. And I'm not talking about Jon Stewart, like that stuff was like overtly political, right? But do you think that the focus has changed from telling a good story with an underpinning of something to focus on the diversity of the character for the sake of the diversity of the character, and then the story being secondary to that push for diversity? What's your thought there?
I think one of the things that is direct consequence of the world we live in is that people are hyper aware
Mm,
around the question of diversity, and they're polarized,
mm,
right? So I would argue, if you think about comics, and I do want you to pause, like everyone out there is, if you think about the comics you read as a kid, they always have these sort of political, social narratives in them. Yes, Green Arrow, Green Lantern, that's super overt. But, think about runs of the Avengers where they're dealing with questions of the environment. Think
mm,
about, questions in Batman about crime. And that's a constant actually in Batman. What is the Wayne Foundation doing?
mm,
What is Batman doing? How are we helping people? This idea of trying to help people. I mean, Batman is actually a great example because the character does not kill, supports a hospital for the criminally insane, Arkham, and then and literally spends millions upon millions of dollars on urban development and urban renewal and social program through a foundation. The same thing is true in the Avengers, the Maria Stark Foundation, right? Where the Avengers, like, the idea that there is no kind of a political narrative in it is wrong. What is different now is that your understanding of the nature of the political narrative
mm,
has changed. And
mm,
also because we no longer simply use allegory.
mm.
Like earlier, 50, 60, 70 years ago, it was always an allegory. It was always, hey, this alien is standing in for black people. Hey,
Got it. Yeah.
this thing is standing in for this thing. One of the things that's happened over time is that those people are actually the characters in the story. So
Instead of some alien or something from the future or some other, it is
right,
the actual
actual
thing
thing, right,
that you see in your real world, right?
right,
And to your
yeah.
point, I think what I hear you saying is that nothing's changed except for us and maybe our perceptions of what we are reading and seeing. That is maybe what has evolved. Is that a fair point to make? Because I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is that a fair point to make?
I do think it's really important to recognize that we have changed in terms of our ability to interpret these things
Mhm.
and what we're looking for. I also think it's true that there are more creators trying to tell more sophisticated stories
Mm,
and adding in the context of having these characters that are actually the thing. It's not an allegory
mm,
anymore. It's no longer an alien standing in for black people or an alien standing in for immigrants or whatever. It's an actual thing.
yeah.
And so therefore you have people from diverse backgrounds wanting to tell stories that are speaking to their lived experience. Again, when we think about comics, even the stories that were quote unquote progressive were written by basically white liberal people. And it's only until, in the last sort of couple of decades that you've seen a large number of people of color, a large number of women, LGBTQ people able to write these stories. And it's important to recognize these people write stories that are very traditional.
Mhm.
And they also write stories that, also reflect perhaps more complex commentaries about race, identity, culture, and power, and all these other things.
So
And
sorry, I cut you off. My apologies.
and I think we can recognize that, right? Jonathan Hickman's run on X-Men recently. You can look at that and go like, well, that's a really complicated commentary on the Black Lives Matter movement. But you can also not look at it that way. Right?
Yeah.
Like I looked at it that way. Go, huh? That's actually really interesting. He is taking a group of people that have always been a proxy for the downtrodden, be it African Americans in the civil rights era, be it LGBTQ people, so on and so forth, and said, "Oh, these people are no longer going to like sit quietly in the corner. They're going to be their own nation," which arguably can be associated with the new generation of rights movements that we see happening in the public square, right? Like we're no longer going to sit silently and be abused. We're going to assert ourselves.
Now, let me ask you this. Do you think that Jonathan Hickman wrote it from that perspective, or is that you as a scholar looking at it from that perspective?
Now, that's a good question. I think John Hickman is a really smart writer. He's one of my favorite writers. I'm a huge fan of John Hickman.
As am I.
I think he probably is, as he has talked about in interviews and stuff, interpreting the current political and social landscape in a way that is drawing inference from it. But he's also a sophisticated storyteller. And and I'm going to acknowledge, I don't think every comic book writer, every person who's writing a comic book is a great comic book writer.
Yeah.
And that's been true for as long as we had comic books.
Well said. Well said. There's a lot of stinkers out there, brother.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that their intent is to injure either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
So for those that are joining a little late, I'm actually sitting down with Julian Chambliss, who is a scholar, author, English professor at Michigan State University, just to name a few of his accolades. And we are having a wonderful conversation about diversity in comics, politics in comics, and he's offering, I personally think, some valuable insight into how some of these things should potentially be viewed. But to that point, as we get ready to wrap up here, Julian, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. You alluded to a few moments ago that we are now starting to get more Black creators, women, and other type of creators in a position to tell stories and to draw art. If you were in a position to give advice to the publishers that are out there that are attempting to have diversity and inclusion and to do it the right way, what advice would you give them? Is it to hire more creators who look like the readership? Is it to make better use of the existing characters that have already been created in comics that are diverse? Is it to create new characters and to build them over time? Like what advice would you give maybe Marvel Comics or DC Comics that are trying to do the right thing by having more diversity?
Right. I would question the idea of like right way versus wrong way. Right. That construction puts the idea of diversity in a negative light.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I think it's always important to recognize that the strength of the United States is always resting in its plurality. Like it's e pluribus unum. It's not, it's not like one person, one, it's all, it's a union of people.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the politicization of that narrative towards a more perfect union is always complicated. But I would say that one of the things that has been successful across all media is, yes, having more diverse voices in the room, telling stories, and not just simply in one part of the process, across the process. So you need diverse editors, you need copy editors, you need artists, you need writers, you need people in advertising, right? Like you need to think about a way to make your tent as open as possible, and that allows for you to balance out these many voices that you get in comics, that you get in the world and are reading comics. And it's also important to recognize that some of the traumas that we've read about and talked about and hear related to comics over the last few years have a lot to do with a very, very niche business. I love comics, but it's a niche business.
Agreed.
With a legacy distribution system that is under pressure from digitization, under pressure from a kind of like cycle of expansion and contraction, that creates very narrow margins for the people who are the end buyer, which is
Agreed.
the comic book shop owner, right? Like we
Right.
forget it's the comic book shop owner who's the end buyer, and what they need is a steady set of people showing up on Wednesday. And the comic book readership has aged, and especially in superhero comics. That's not necessarily the same in terms of like comics as all across all genres. Comics across all genres grown tremendously. And it's important to recognize that.
Mhm.
You know, it's not just simply about Marvel and DC. It's not just simply about superheroes. If there's a genre that you love, you can find it in the comics.
Agreed.
But the challenge for the superhero comic, they have legacy characters, IP that they're trying to maximize the value of in a really dynamic marketplace, right?
Yep.
And we can talk endlessly about that, but we all know it because we all recognize that we make destination purchases when it comes to comic books. That is not a convenience purchase. That is a
No.
destination purchase.
You have to be
So
purposeful when you set out to do that.
right, and
Yeah.
that is not a simple exercise for the retailer, and so they're hypersensitive to disruptions, and as we talked about earlier, the media landscape is primed to create winners and losers for personal gain, right? And so we really have to recognize that those narratives are part and parcel of a broader set of cultural narratives that are very problematic. But at the same time, when we give diverse characters a chance through various channels, you know, Kamala Khan, Miles Morales, you know, they can find an audience. And we know this from history, right? Controversial characters of color have found audience,
Yeah.
right? They didn't always like some of these characters, but now we do. We think of them as mainstays. And so it's important to recognize that the history of comics is one of evolution, and that evolution has usually turned out well. But it is a medium that is under a lot of pressure because we're moving towards a kind of digitization that is profound, and you know we have to keep that in mind. But yeah, diversity across all parts of the process, I think, are ultimately really been successful, and we benefited from that.
Yeah. All right, Julian, I want to again thank you for coming on the show, for sharing your insight with us. I think it's been very informative to me, and I've kind of been glancing at some of the comments over here on the right hand side. So I think people are definitely enjoying your point of view. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for making yourself available, and again, shout out to Owen for connecting the two of us. You have a wonderful website. If you want to shout that out, where people can watch great videos of you lecture and talk about various aspects of this, and I think you also have a podcast as well. But I want to give you a moment to shout out your various digital platforms for people to be able to hear more from you.
Sure. And you can always find me at julianchambliss.com. So JulianChambliss.com. And my podcast is part of a project we have here at Michigan State University, because we have the world's largest publicly accessible collection of comic books. And so I run the research workshop on comic books in the Department of English, the Graphic Possibilities Research Workshop. And we do have a podcast called the Graphic Possibilities Podcast, which you can find wherever you find podcasts, where we talk to creators and we talk to educators and we talk about comics from an academic standpoint. But it's always good and always informative. We just dropped a new episode with Joel Gill, who's a great African-American comic book creator, of course, it's Black History Month. So, always you can check those things out. And if you're interested in learning more about comics from an academic perspective, I would advocate checking out something like the Comic Study Society, which is a great academic organization. They have a great website. You can find lots of information on their website. Or, again, check out the MSU library. We have a reading list there from the Graphic Possibilities research workshop that we put together. So if you want to know more about comics from a particular perspective, that stuff is there and available for you. So always, if you want to know more about comics, check out MSU, and we have stuff that will help you. You can always come to the library if you're in Michigan and come to the reading room and check out and read in the reading room some of these very rare comics that Reggie's probably got slabbed in his house.
Yeah. Count on it, brother. I saw one of the videos you had Lobo one. That was like a Lobo,
Yeah,
and I was like,
Lobo.
yeah, I've got that, man. That's a good book, and it's actually a good read. It is well
Yeah,
illustrated, it is well lettered, and it is also just a good story. And again, you have to expose yourself to these characters because they are really wonderful. And it's unfortunate the legacy of what happened to Lobo, right? The way that they basically canceled the title, retailers started to send it back, and
right.
it's awful. But it was such a great story. I had no clue that there was a black cowboy named Lobo until like a couple of years ago, you know?
Right, yeah, and a great example of a historically lost character, but rediscovered. And yeah, there's so much out there, and of course, lots of contemporary storytellers doing great work as well, both in the superhero genre, but again, always in other genres as well. It's always important to remember comic books in the United States have grown tremendously, and there are lots of things for people to read out there.
Julian, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks a lot for having me.
Take care.
You too.
And I did not cut him off. Did you see the pause? I paused twice. So the Comic Hall crew just followed Julian on the Instagram machine. He and I connected over there. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with Julian. And again, these are not easy conversations to have, right? But they are important conversations for us to have as a comic book community. And again, I want to thank MVP for coming on a few weeks ago, and I want to thank Julian for coming on tonight to enlighten us to various perspectives that people have out there. With that, we're going to wrap this thing up. As always, if you guys need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects. Take care.